All right. Our next speaker was suggested by Robin, actually, at the Richard Dawkins Foundation. And I just realized I knew that I recognized her from somewhere, but I could never place what it was. And she used to host a TV show, or maybe do you still host it? Or hosted a TV show called Dinner and a Movie. Do you guys remember that show? She was the host. She's a New York Times best-selling author. She's appeared on Bill Maher, actually, just a couple of weeks ago. The guest that comes in at the end, which I think is the important one. She's an actress and an author and a New York Times best-selling author. Her book is Wherever You Go, There They Are, which is available at fine bookstores everywhere, including the one back here. And Annabelle will be signing books after her talk back in the bookstore. And there's a chapter on secularism in her book. Please welcome Annabelle Gurwitch.
Thank you. Ooh, that's loud and unattractive. Good morning, humans. I'm going to title this talk, Slouching Towards Secular Humanism. I mean, I place a high value on good posture, but I always think it's good to lower expectations. And I want to say this talk is going to be a little bit different from Julian's talk, except that it's just sort of a coincidence. I did star in 2 movies with Michael J. Fox. And I just want to say he's a very good kisser, just for the record. But I only got to star in those movies, just by the way, because I was the right height. That was a very important thing as an actress, because he is rather small. So I'm going to talk this morning about how I broke up with magical thinking and God, and my journey to secular humanism, and why I've become an advocate for secular humanist groups, and why I've been writing about humanism in the LA Times and the New York Times, and why there's a chapter in my new book on how we as secular humanists are looking to form community. Because it was kind of an unlikely journey. Now, many people here, and I think across the world, come to humanism after having grown up in very religious families. This was not the case for me. No, my big old love affair with God was of my own making. I grew up in Miami Beach in one of those very reformed Jewish temples. That's the kind where Blowing in the Wind is played in every ceremony. In fact, I thought that was part of the Bible, the Bob Dylan chapter. And I showed a little bit of early promise as a humanist when I declared that I was an atheist at my bat mitzvah. And of course, my parents weren't the kind of Jewish people that even minded. My father said, I don't fucking care what you fucking believe in, but we've paid a lot of money for the catering. You know, this is priorities, right? And so I went through with the bat mitzvah, and that would have been a good sign towards some critical thinking. Alas, something else happened. At that point in my life, I came down with a very serious condition. And you know, when the drama bug bites, it is incurable. And so I headed off in the direction, instead of critical thinking, towards the theater tribe. And this was a very, very insular community I was growing up in Miami Beach. It was a very Jewish community, and we had the Temple Beth Shalom Players, in which we did only plays by Jewish authors. And I do consider it lucky that when I was growing up in the 70s, there was no videotape available, because otherwise I would be a shut-in today. If you could see the footage of my portrayal as Linda Lohman in Death of a Salesman at age 14. Also, we did plays like Jewish musicals, you know, and I wouldn't say that I had any particular talent, but I did have a pair of good dress shoes and an ability to learn lines. So I would get cast in these shows. And I just want to give you an idea of what kind of things we were doing. You can consider for yourself the age appropriateness of this kind of play. 14-year-old girls doing the production of Milk and Honey, which was a Broadway musical, which was actually premiered the year I was born, 1961. The play is about Jewish women from the suburbs who go to Israel to find husbands because they're all divorced. Now, this is at the same time that our mothers were buying us Ms. magazines, and there was a lot of consciousness raising, but not for us at Temple Beth Shalom. I'm going to give you a little sample of the lyrics. Mrs. Siegel, Cincinnati, would like to believe that though she came here Mrs. Siegel, Cincinnati, she will leave here Mrs. Levy, Tel Aviv. Sung by 14-year-old girls hoping to go out in the world and make their way. A little bit of a contradiction there. But what happens, as it often happens for people for whom the drama bug has bitten, I moved to New York to study acting. And what happened also would have been a good sign, you would think, towards critical thinking, was that I found my way to the avant-garde theater world. What happened was I went to NYU to look at the program there, and I found myself watching a production. And it wasn't in a theater, it was in a rehearsal room, what was called a black box with no stage. I'd never seen anything like that. We didn't have that at Temple Beth Shalom. And there were two actors, neither of whom looked outwardly Jewish. And they were speaking at the same time. I had never seen that kind of thing before. And at one point, the woman jumped on top of a piano and said, "I'm fucking a piano!" I thought, I've never seen this kind of thing before. And then in the middle of the production, they had a pizza delivered. A pizza delivery guy came in and served pizza to the actors on stage and to the audience, bringing us all together in this sort of ritualistic pizza ceremony. And I thought, I don't know what the fuck these people are doing, but that's what I want to do with my life. And that's how I entered this avant-garde theater world. And what I found out was they weren't just, screwing around here. The experimental avant-garde theater world was greatly influenced by the French surrealist playwright Antoine Artaud, whose seminal work was The Theater of Cruelty. And Artaud's idea was that Western theater had fallen into a kind of lassitude and needed a lacerating wake-up call. And so this avant-garde theater world was really a great bastion of critical thinking, trying to push the limits and push the envelope of traditional theater, bringing people together in a way that resembled, in some ways you could say, in ancient rituals and ceremonies. And so this, again, would seem to be a good move for me towards critical thinking, towards leading a life of questioning. But at that same time, something else happened, which was my parents lost all their money. This had been a pattern in our life. My father was a gambler, but this really had wiped him out. And they were bankrupt, and I had to drop out of college. And I was alone in New York, and I was incredibly desperate and disenfranchised, and I didn't have any family, and I had no idea how I was going to make this life work for myself. And this puts you in a position which I think can help you understand why some people turn to religion or God, or in my case, a UFO cult. So what happened was, it was the 1980s, and I want to just set the stage for you that there was a lot of New Agey kind of thought, which was kind of a watered-down version of Buddhism or Hinduism or something-isms happening in New York at the time. So I was seeking for something to hold on to. And first I went to an ashram and I tried to become a devotee of a guru, but she was so beautiful that I just kept asking myself, my God, who was her dermatologist? I just could not get past how great her skin was to get into the deeper teachings that I'm sure she was teaching. And then I tried a form of Buddhism. A lot of people in the New York scene, in fact, in order to get cast in a Broadway show, everyone at the time was chanting Nam Myoho Renge Kyo. They were all practicing Nichiren Daishonin Buddhism, which one could really argue whether it is a form of Buddhism, because it's basically teaches you that you should be chanting for a designer handbag or a part in a Broadway show. And I got kicked out of that form of Buddhism for having the temerity to suggest that maybe there was a whole idea that we were going to spread this throughout the universe, this Nam Myoho Renge Kyo chant. And I suggested that maybe if there was life on other planets and we managed to reach them, they might have a different chant. So I was uninvited back to Buddhism in New York in the 1980s. But then what happened was I walked into an apartment in the West Village of New York, and I just want to say there was only a small amount of drugs involved. Just the smallest amount of weed. I would like to say there was more, but there wasn't. There was a psychic, and he was channeling disembodied entities, and I felt I had found my people. He told us that we had been chosen to usher in the new age, the age of Aquarius, the new age of consciousness on Earth. Was a little bit of the musical Hair involved, I think. That was a very popular show. And I can only blame my inability to resist this on two things: being completely desperate and disenfranchised, and poor science education growing up in Florida, which is one of the reasons why I am so against returning choices in education and other things to the States, because what you end up with are people like me who are susceptible because of our lack of science education. At the time I was growing up in Florida, science wasn't required, but what was required was a course titled Americanism versus Communism. Not even capitalism. Think about it, right? So this group, this idea, this is one of those, magical thinking groups. A lot of what we were doing was based on this kind of positive thinking mantra, you can create your own reality, which of course has the dark side to it, as we know. If you are creating your success and you're creating your health, then if you should develop cancer or a tumor or find yourself stuck in a genocide, well, that's because somehow you've created that with your thoughts. It's incredibly embarrassing for me to admit that this was something that I believed in at the time. And I want to just mention that, I consider this a cult because of the totality of the belief system that we had adopted at the time, even though it doesn't fit the traditional definition of a cult. There was no money exchange. There was no recruitment policy. There was no dress requirement. I just want to make that very clear. I would never have joined a cult if you had to wear unattractive clothing. That would have been it for me completely. But there was not only this idea that we were going to usher in this new age, we were also told that there was a prophecy. we were told that we were the reincarnated family of the pharaoh Akhenaten in the 18th dynasty in Egypt. Yeah, I'm saying this with a straight face. It's extraordinary, right? And I was one of the daughters, of course, the favorite daughter of the pharaoh. And as such, as this reincarnated family, we had this destiny. The universe had a destiny in store for us. And that destiny was to be part of the first contact of extraterrestrials, the aliens who had seeded life on this planet, who were going to come and take us back as representatives back to the home planet. We were given a date and a time, and I just want to say, just as an incredible measure of how little critical thinking I was doing at the time, it never occurred to me to say, what about me, Annabelle Gurwitch, trained in avant-garde theater, would recommend me for space travel? Why would I be a good representative of our planet? I just accepted this because that's how incredibly vulnerable and desperate I was at the time. I wish that I could say that I was just born into a, seriously religious family that I had to leave, but no, I chose this for myself. And this, I believed this, and it seemed to be, I had all kinds of what I considered, proof of this being true and real, because part of it was I was going to become an actress, and I would be a representative of our new age consciousness on television and all these things. And I never told anyone that I was working with as an actress that I believed this at the time, but I did start to get work as an actress. And so I took this as a confirmation of this belief. Now, I don't need to tell you that that prophecy didn't come true. I wouldn't be standing here today. But of course it didn't. In fact, our psychic leader died of AIDS in the 1980s as AIDS swept through the West Village of New York, and with his death, the group crumbled. I didn't even actually know the real names of many of the people in the group. I knew them as their nicknames, like Angel and Feather. But as I went on, even without this group, I still held on to that kind of magical thinking. I mean, I really did let go of this idea that I was going to leave the planet, except, every once in a while I would think, well, maybe the time zones are different on this other planet. And we thought they were coming in 1995, but perhaps they had a problem with their fueling. These things happen. But mostly I had let go of this idea, but I became one of those girls, I call them the universe girls, that think that the universe is working for them to get them good jobs and great parking spots. And I had, lucky socks. I had my lucky payphone where I would go to get messages to see if I got jobs, and if I got a job on Seinfeld, which I did, at the lucky payphone, then it was really true. There was this magical universe looking out for me. And it's so embarrassing for me to say how long this went on, but it did. Into my 30s, I clung to this magical thinking, really until my son was born. If you've seen my openly secular video, then I've written about this in one of my books. My son was born with a birth defect, which is known as the acronym VACTERL, which is an acronym for a number of systems in the body that simply just do not form, and there's really no known cause. Certainly not from thinking non-positive thoughts. But when the moment he was born, and the doctor told us that he had no anus, and they would have to make a colostomy, and they would ultimately repair his body, which they did, I just thought, people started saying to me things like, everything happens for a reason. And I thought, oh, give me a fucking break. There is no reason why a baby would be born without an anus. No. And they would say, God doesn't give you anything you can handle. I got those talks. And I was like, no, I really can't handle this. No, really. And, in that moment, all that magical thinking and all that God was really wiped away. And that is even more embarrassing for me than to admit that I was part of this whole UFO, New Agey thing, because that's really even worse, that it took my own little life, something happening in my own life, to take that belief away from me, because, I should have thought that just from living in the world, and that's as embarrassing for me as having had that belief to begin with. But it's not really much of a surprise, I think, that after I let go of that magical thinking, that I started writing, because writing involves critical thinking. And actually, my first essay that was published was a piece it was a commentary on NPR about breaking up with God, and how it was called "We're Praying for You," and it was about the experience of my son being born and having everyone tell me they were praying for us. And I became a commentator on NPR, and I started writing these books. This is my fourth book now, and I discovered, my what I consider my voice in writing. And for me, that's to write about the dissonance between expectation and reality. So my first book is a book called Fired, and that was a book that was inspired after I was fired by Woody Allen from a play, and that has to do with the expectation of meeting your comedy idol and the reality of the fact that he found my performance, as he said, retarded. And that became a project that I collaborated with former Labor Secretary Robert Reich on, and I went across the country and collected stories in a Studs Terkel type of fashion that really looked at the new paradigm of work in America. And then my next book was a book called You Say Tomato, I Say Shut Up. That's a book about marriage and expectations versus reality. And the premise of that book was that people think that marriage is going to solve all their problems, when actually it's the beginning of your problems, much bigger problems. Then my last book was a book called I See You Made an Effort. And in that book, I write about how we view aging and the dissonance between the ridiculous, what I call a canard of that whole saying of, 50 is the new 40, because when you're 50, you realize nobody who's 40 thinks you're the same age as them. Who are you kidding? And this latest book of mine, Wherever You Go, There They Are, that premise was that no matter how hard you try to escape your crazy family, you just end up in another crazy family. And what I was really doing is, what I'm doing in this book is I'm looking at our human need for community and groups and for the collective, and I start by writing about my own family, and I write about all the families I've joined accidentally or on purpose. And of course, one of the biggest kinds of communities that people look for family in is religious families. And so I wanted to write about secular humanists, but to be honest, at the time that I started writing this book, I really didn't have a connection to the community. But then something happened. I was looking on the internet, as you do, very late at night, scrolling through videos, and I saw a video of people helping refugees, people who'd crossed the Mediterranean as they were landing in Greece. And they were Americans, and I wasn't aware of American groups who'd been going over there. And I was so moved by this. I was thinking, okay, I got my pen out, and I thought, okay, I've got to write this down. I'm going to write down what organization this is, because I want to go volunteer. And then this very good-looking young man, who probably was not really a volunteer but was cast because he was a very good-looking young man in this video, turns to the camera and he says, I'm doing this because, you know, I just want these people to have a great experience with Christians. And I thought, oh, really? Really? Well, what are we atheists? What are we atheists going to do? When are we going to have a group that does service? And of course, I just wasn't aware of all of the groups and all of the organizations that were out there, and so I went on a journey to find this community. And so in my book, I write about Center for Inquiry, I write about Sunday Assembly, I write about the Godless Revival, and how secular humanist groups have been developing to take the place of these religious organizations, to provide this need. And that's, of course, what we're all doing here, because no matter how far we've progressed as humans with our technology, nothing takes the place of coming together in person. It's, in a way, I feel like I've returned to my roots in theater, because there is nothing like this to bring us together. You know, when I was studying avant-garde theater, I learned about this phrase called collective effervescence. And that was a phrase coined by the anthropologist Victor Turner, who studied ritual and performance. And he was looking at how we could take ancient rituals and bring those kind of electricity into the theater. And this is what sociologists and anthropologists call this elixir that happens when people get together, when strangers get together, when you come together in a moment, in a liminal moment like this, when the rest of the world stops and we take a moment to make community. And I think that that's the value that I truly, relate to in the secular humanist community that I write about in my book. And, I want to mention that I feel like I live a very privileged life as an artist. My saying I'm an atheist doesn't impact my ability to survive the way it does for people across the world, and it hasn't disenfranchised me from my family. But it does actually affect me in just small little ways. The other day, I was reading one of my Amazon one-star reviews, which is really fun, because if you check out the Amazon one-star reviews, it's always people with, like, Hemingway, boring. And what the review said was, Annabelle Gurwitch is really bitter. I just learned that she's not a believer, and if she were a believer, she wouldn't be so bitter. And I just want to state for the record that I don't consider myself bitter. I just consider myself bitchy, which is a value I much prefer to bitter. If I was a believer, I would be bitter. Because of everything that's happening in the world right now. So it's become, part of my mission as a writer and as an advocate to use my platform to write about humanism. And I think it's a particularly really important time right now. I mean, we've all mentioned that. But, Attorney General Jeff Sessions has said publicly that secular people have no place in government. That's a really strong statement. So when we say, well, we want to run for office and it's really important, that's absolutely important, and I'm all for it. I think we have to acknowledge that there is real pushback there happening, and of course we see the encroachment of religion as all part of the Trump agenda. And not only that, though, I write in my book, you'll see I've enlisted a bunch of friends like physicist Lisa Randall, Barbara Ehrenreich, who's a great thinker and biologist, to take on magical thinking in every way, because I think that's a really pernicious part of American and culture throughout the world. I see it as not too much of a leap to say that the way that that enters people's thinking, even in the most casual sense, it's very popular, particularly amongst women in America, this idea of vision boards and manifesting your goals and positive thinking and quantum something. There's a lot of quantum out there right now. There's actually something I was researching the other day called quantum jumping, which is courses in how to jump from one of your lives to another life because you're having the multiverse is very popular right now. And I think all of that kind of magical thinking, it's not too much of a leap to take that kind of thought and see how that enters into even our politics. Maybe big old wealthy daddy, all-powerful rich guy Trump is going to save all of us. Maybe somehow climate change won't happen in my lifetime, and I may not have kids. Whew, dodged a bullet. I think this is it's not a stretch. So I always take on magical thinking throughout the book. And that is really my talk. I was going to read a little bit, but I don't know what our timing is. Where are we at, Bill? Questions or read? You choose. It's his democracy. Read? Okay, I'm going to read a little. I'm going to read a little bit from this book, not from the chapter on secular humanism, but from another chapter which has to do with magical thinking and how easily it slips into our culture and how kind of irresistible it is. So, can I switch? This is so high tech. I feel very, yes. Hello? Is this one on? Great. Does not sound like it. Oh, now it does. Okay, so I'm going to set this up for you. I was having a moment, maybe a vulnerable moment, where I decided I wanted to go on a retreat. And I signed up for a retreat in Northern California without reading about it, which was always a mistake. And in the way that the internet makes things so easy for you, you just hit a button and you've bought a really expensive pair of shoes, or you've signed up accidentally for a digital detox camp where there's a no alcohol policy. So, because I hadn't read the pamphlet about this I thought I was going to a summer camp, like a weekend summer camp, where we would play softball or volleyball and have some wine. But no, it was more of an idea that someone had about making a tribe and making a family, sort of a little bit sort of Manson family-ish. And we were all gonna bond and make this family together, this summer family. And to set up the story, it was really cold. And I was just freezing the entire time and really miserable. And you had to have a nickname. I'm not really a nickname person. I don't know if you can tell. But everyone had their chosen nicknames, and they were all super, happy, and everybody was like, Earth Flower, Crystal Haze, and there were workshops on meditating on crystals, which, hold the memory of everything that's ever happened in the past and can communicate that memory to you. It was all this kind of a thing. So I was the only camper who chose irony for a nickname. My nickname was Sunshine. And I went to my counselor and I said, Popcorn, I really hate it here. And she said, but we all love you. I said, Popcorn, I really want to go home. And she said, but we really love you. I'm like, oh, fuck, I'm getting nowhere with these people, and they've taken my phone from me, so I might as well give in. She said, why don't you go and take this survival workshop? So I go up to take this survival workshop, and because there's also no clocks allowed, the instructor was too late to give us survival techniques. And, but he did propose this. Oh, and so and I just want to mention, to set this up right, because there were no clocks, right, everyone had to refer to time in a way that all of these people understood time. So you'd have to say something like, in the time that it takes to pasteurize your own goat cheese, in the time that it takes to have your tattoo removed, in the time that it takes to watch a Game of Thrones episode. Now, none of these things meant anything to me, so I spent the entire time saying, how many Seinfelds is that? It was a real culture clash, and in so many ways. So, finally, Mellow Out, our instructor, shows up, and he points to a dome shape a few feet away. It's a sweat lodge, he tells us, and it was built by the members of the last camp session. But before we can go in, he wants to share the wisdom of the forest people with us. Don't believe the timeline you've been told, he tells us. Two-legged has been walking on Turtle Island since the time of the dinosaurs. Excuse me, I say. So you're saying that fossil records, as interpreted through radiometric dating, a scientific practice accepted across the globe, are incorrect? Yes, he answers. Now, who would like to participate in a sweat lodge? This will entail all 15 of us squeezing inside a muddy, black 12 by 9 foot enclosure with temperatures reaching 180 degrees, facilitated by someone who won't be keeping track of time, to experience a purification ritual so fraught with danger that it recently caused the death of several people in Arizona. Did you say that the temperatures might reach 180 degrees? Yes, he answers, and I'm the first one to put her hands up because I am so fucking cold. And we enter on our knees, crawling across the dirt floor in a clockwise direction, as instructed, each of us calling out in Lakota Sioux, Mataki Oasin, or its English translation, all my relations. Mello asks who feels they can handle sitting in the inner ring of the lodge, and I scurry over to the spot closest to the fire pit because I've schwitzed in my share of saunas. Finally, my glamping background will come into handy. And one by one, he toasts fire-heated volcanic rocks into the lodge on a broken shovel held together with duct tape. And Mello calls the rocks grandpas because rocks are our ancestors. As the temperature rises, I am hoping that the woman who is dressed as Florence Nightingale is an actual medical professional, because I'm seated only 6 inches away from the sacred fire, and one of our grandpas is rolling dangerously close to my toes. Mellow pours water on the rocks and invokes the spirit world, and the sound of drums and flute and chanting fills the lodge. 2 Seinfelds into the ceremony. We've sweated into each other's skin. We've puffed from the same pipe. We've drunk from the same water jug, and our numbers are halved. And Mellow praises our warrior-like endurance, and he invites us to share a prayer or a song. Someone warbles a tune she picked up in Papua New Guinea. Someone sings a Sikh melody. Another fellow traveler leads a call-in response in what might be Klingon or binary code. As the drum passes to me, signaling it's my turn to make an offering, the mud sticks to my thighs. The smell of mugwort chokes my lungs, and I am gripped with an intense desire to fit into this tribe. I will sing something that shows that I occasionally eat low on the food chain. And I read McSweeney's. Okay, I don't read it, but I can spell it correctly. But when I open my mouth, what comes out is Hava Nagila. The most cliched, overused folk song that was sung at Camp Blue Star, my Jewish summer camp, at my bat mitzvah, at weddings the world over, by my parents and their parents and all my relations, perhaps for thousands of years, but probably not all the way back to the time of the dinosaurs. And those hipsters, even the ones who are completely naked by this point, but who don't want to make eye contact with me because I remind them of their mothers, sings with me. They all sing with me. And for the time that it takes for a piece of bazooka bubblegum to lose its flavor, I am legitimately someone who can call herself Sunshine. And we emerge from the lodge, and the people who haven't already shed their clothing strip down to wade in a nearby stream. And I smile, but I decline the invitation. I've gotten naked with plenty of people whose names I don't know. But in my heart, I know I will never be joining a tribe who takes themselves so seriously or believes that dinosaurs and humans coexisted. And I don't want to traumatize the younger campers by treating them to a glimpse of the inevitable future of all flesh. Thank you. Thank you.